Very good. Thank you, Dario. Hello and welcome everybody to the launch event for the Spirit Level at 15. So the enduring impact of inequality with our patrons and founders and authors of the Spirit Level, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. We're delighted to have them on the call and we're delighted to see so many of you. Thank you for making the time and joining us. So a couple of quick points of housekeeping. We are recording this call, but we are very much looking for interaction. So we'll be taking questions throughout, and you can use the chat thread to do that and to share questions with Kate and Richard, and we'll attempt to answer as many of those as we can. So to introduce myself, I'm George Wayman. I'm a co-chair of the Equality Trust, and it's an organisation that's been working to address inequality in the UK for 15 years, since Kate and Richard set it up, and that's through a whole range of ways, including research, education and campaigning. And as you'll hear in what's to come in this evening's presentation, we're an organisation that's really going places. We have an organisation, a new strategy, we have a new website, we have a refreshed board, and an experienced leadership team and a hungry team that want to make change. So I'm really excited to introduce them all for you this evening. So I guess I was drawn to the Equality Trust in large part thanks to the Spirit Level. The idea that inequality is not inevitable, that it's a choice, and that it harms everybody, but particularly those at the bottom of the income spectrum the most. Those were things which resonated strongly with me, and which motivated and inspired me to join a local group and ultimately become a trustee and co-chair of the Equality Trust. And that's what we're seeing. Increasingly, people want to take change, want to make action and be involved in changing their community on inequality. So as well as the update on the Spirit Level 15 years on, we'll also be talking through ways in which that change can happen this evening and ways in which you can take part. So to tell us more about that, I'm going to hand over to Jo Whittams, our co-executive director.
Thank you so much, George. And to echo what George just said, it is amazing to see so many people here this evening and so many names that I recognise popping up in the chat. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for all your support over the years. Dismantling concentrations of income, wealth and power is, as we always knew it would be, a long and arduous journey. And like all long, arduous journeys, they are better undertaken when well-resourced and in good company. So we're really glad that you chose to join us tonight. Some of you may know the origin story of the Equality Trust is closely entwined with the book, The Spirit Level. Bill Kerry, co-founder and one of my ex-colleagues, saw Richard speaking in 2006, which led him to read Richard's book, The Impact of Inequality. That book confirmed to him that everything that he was feeling about what was wrong with the way our economy is organised and how inequality was negatively impacting on everyone was true, and crucially, it backed this up with evidence. He felt that for maximum impact, this evidence needed a much wider audience. Bill contacted Kate and Richard about setting up an organisation, and in early 2007, the name the Equality Trust was registered, and the Spirit Level was in that year accepted for publication. Both launched in March 2009 with the backing of long-term Equality Trust funders, Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. And since then, the Equality Trust has mainstreamed the debate around why inequality is bad for everyone, and researched, campaigned, and influenced for recommendations that reduce inequalities. The original Spirit Level was name-checked by David Cameron during the 2010 election campaign, and we continue to be a research-led campaigning organisation commissioning and conducting research that shapes public understanding, the media agenda and political debate on both sides of the House. For example, over the past 2 years, we've had citations of our reports on topics such as the explosion of the number of billionaires and billionaire wealth in the UK, the scandalous levels of work our young people are being asked and expected to do unpaid in order to secure paid employment, the woeful inadequacy of social security, which in many cases is destitution by design, and the staggering cost of inequality, with our research finding that if the UK if UK inequality was reduced to the average of other rich countries, we would save over £100 billion in a year just on reduced imprisonment and improved physical and mental health. There has been a significant shift in the understanding, the dialogue, and the importance of inequality reduction, but progress has been slow and pushing uphill against a backdrop of overlapping crises, including the climate emergency, the financial crash, austerity, Brexit, and COVID-19. High and entrenched levels of inequality in the UK have grown and deepened, as evidenced by the explosion of extreme wealth and increasing CEO pay against the also increasing numbers of people living in poverty and using food banks. Income from work is, for many, insufficient to cover the basic essentials. But it doesn't have to be this way. Centuries worth of political decisions have led us here, and we can decide to organise our economy and our society differently. And we now have a new government, which may bring with it opportunities for progressive and long-lasting change. So how are we, the Equality Trust, going to harness this potential and these possible opportunities? What are our plans? As George mentioned, we have looked at our strategy this year and refreshed our vision. That is for everyone to have a good life. Our diagnosis is that the UK's severe levels of inequality enable the wealthy elite to amass enormous profits, which increases inequality, which, as we know, harms us all. We work to challenge those concentrations of income, wealth, and power to create the conditions where people and communities can thrive. To make this happen, we gather evidence, build broad coalitions for change, campaign, and support others to do so. So for our strategy for the next 3 years, we will be working towards the following aims: that people change their perception of inequality and the ways that they think and talk about it, that people, organisations, and communities are able to have a new vision for society based on different ways of working, which can reduce inequalities of income, wealth, and power, improving the lives of everyone. That people, organisations, and communities have more power in addressing the inequalities affecting them, and people in positions of influence and power change policy and practice to reduce inequalities, with the UK government embedding inequality reduction goals in strategy, planning, and spending decisions. We also know that public concern around inequality hasn't matched the rate and speed at which inequality has increased. And part of what we're doing is showing why that this is a concern and communicating that change is not just possible, it is necessary. We're doing this through reaching people in the places that they dwell. So via our dedicated digital comms strategy, using video, blogs, graphics, and we know from feedback that we are making inroads into changing the way people think about the economy. We're also working to widen the net of who gets to imagine a different future. Responding to the concept of reflexive impotence coined by Mark Fisher, which he describes where people recognise the flawed nature of our economic structure, but believe there are no means of affecting change. Inequality can only truly be dismantled under democratised and decentralised economic structures. And our goal is to support people, organisations, and communities to believe that a different future is possible, reimagine what that could look like, and to connect with power holders in order to campaign and call for the change they want to see. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's announcement for greater devolution is a positive step in achieving this, and it needs to truly centre community wealth, not just growing the wealth of big business and the already wealthy. We want to see power in the hands of local government, and we want to see communities be the architects of policy design to help ensure that different voices and different experiences are considered in strategic and budgetary decision making. We know those decisions will be more robust, progressive, and serve the interests of greater numbers within the communities. As we've mentioned, earlier this year, We had a look at our strategy, thinking about the potential opportunities that might be afforded by a change of government, and have touched on our vision, mission, and strategic aims earlier. The final element in this work was to develop a new visual identity for the Equality Trust. So, as you can see, the equal sign logo has been with us as a stalwart since 2009. And we really felt it was time for a change, to reflect, for a logo of beauty to kind of emerge from a bit of a period of being in a chrysalis state. So here it is. The story behind this logo centers on the strength and beauty in coming together like we are all today. You can see that the main component explores the visual of a seed, which signifies potential, purpose, and growth. In our logo, the seeds are united with other like-minded units, creating a stronger, dynamic network. And within that, each seed provides value in equal parts, multiple perspectives, individual skills and qualities that collectively create a stronger narrative and converge into an inner circle. This coming together also creates a new identity that is greater than the sum of its parts, a flower, which we feel signifies hope and beauty. This logo represents the potential in the work that we do and all the amazing things we want to achieve, the beauty of coming together, but also with a nod to the fragility of this work. Now, we know it's quite a journey from our OG equal sign logo, but we hope you grow to love our new identity as much as we do. And finally, at the very start, we mentioned that having you with us on this journey is a huge part of our success. And this is as true today as it ever was. So one of our calls to action for you is to help us spread the word and shape that debate about inequality. So talk to your family and friends about what inspired you this evening or what angered you from what you hear later. Have conversations with your colleagues and neighbours, maybe at the school gates, over Thursday night drinks, Friday night dinners. Even if you feel like it, in the queue for shopping or waiting for a train. So we really recognise that public concern needs to grow about inequality, and you can help us build that concern. And then together we can build pressure for positive change. Thank you so much for your time. I am now going to hand over to Richard Wilkinson, who will remind us exactly why reducing inequality matters so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jo. Nice introduction. I find this situation of seeing the spirit level after 15 years really remarkable. And actually, for me, it's set in work on inequality going back to, I don't know how many decades, but what's been remarkable, I think, about that journey is we started off thinking about health and health inequalities and thinking about them in extraordinarily material terms, as if it wasn't a matter of your feelings and attitudes and stress and anxiety, not social comparisons. It was just a matter of your relationship with whether you had better or worse working conditions, jobs, and so on. But as we became aware of the importance of stress and social anxiety affecting health, actually pushing up death rates quite substantially, we began to realize that actually stress and anxiety feed into so many other things, and started looking at those outcomes, Kate and I, at and not only physical health, but mental health, drug addiction, maths and literacy scores of young people, violence, homicides, bullying, imprisonment rates, teenage birth rates, trust, ability, and even the rate of social mobility. All these problems are not just a sort of random group. They're all things related to all things with social gradients. So, for instance, everyone knows that where health is worse and where kids tend to do worse is in the poorest areas of our society. It's those kind of problems that get worse with more inequality. The only surprise is that they get worse not just amongst the poor. The biggest effects are amongst the poor, but they affect all of us to a lesser extent. So even middle-class people with good jobs, education, and so on would do better if they lived in a more equal society. By which I mean they might live a bit longer, their kids do better at school, they'd be less likely to become victims of violence. In that sense, we'd all do better. As Joe said, inequality is expensive, and TET did that report saying that it cost an additional 106 billion that we were less equal than the average OECD country. But that was just on poorer health, mental illness, homicide, imprisonment. And actually, the effects of inequality, as I've said, are much greater than that. Social cohesion, trust, kids' maths and literacy scores, obesity, all the rest of it. If we'd been able to cost those things, the cost would be astronomical. So when you think of that estimate of over 100 billion pounds, remember that it's only a small part of the overall picture. I want to say a little bit about why inequality affects so many different outcomes. They seem quite different. How kids do at school and violence or teenage, they're different problems. And yet, why do they all move in inequality and with inequality? Related also to why they're all worse amongst the poor, higher rates of these difficulties. I think to understand this, one has to see inequality not as simply a matter of whether you get a bigger or smaller share of the pie, but as a social relationship. A social relationship that puts us in a hierarchy that people always see as if it was a hierarchy from better to worse. Inferiority and superiority, dominance and subordination. This is at the core of the effects of inequality. So think of inequality not only as a social relationship, but as a cause of stress. It makes social comparisons invidious, more difficult in every way. It increases those feelings of lack of confidence, self-doubt, that psychologists call the social evaluative threat. Your worries about how you're seen and judged. And I think actually that there are worse stressors than that, like losing your home or your job or whatever, but those are less common in the population. When they're thinking of stress and anxiety across the population as a whole, these are the biggest stressors, our worries about how we're seen and judged. And I think it's really important to recognize that, because I think those are also the biggest limitations to the quality of our lives. Our anxieties about how we're seen and judged by other people. Before finishing, I just want to emphasize that we do know a lot about the social processes, if you like, the mechanisms connecting inequality to these outcomes. For instance, we know that homicide is related to inequality because it's triggered by disrespect, loss of face, and humiliation. We know that health is related to inequality because inequality is a social stressor, and we know how stress affects health. Mental illness. People have now shown that issues to do with dominance and subordination have effects on a great range of mental illnesses. Imprisonment is related to inequality because more unequal societies become more punitive. As if there's less trust or more fear up and down the social hierarchy. And so more people get imprisoned for longer. And it's that really pushes up imprisonment rates. So think of these kinds of mechanisms, and we do know about a lot of them, but also remember that because of these effects, it makes inequality one of the most powerful, perhaps the most powerful influence on the quality of life through the damage to social cohesion, the damage to our relationships. You know, research has shown repeatedly that one of the most important determinants of the quality of life is the quality of our social relationships, whether we're involved in community life, whether we have friends. That's where inequality does its most important damage. So I'm going to hand over to Kate now, who did most of the work on updating the spirit level data. So thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Richard. I am going to share my screen with everybody. Let's see. Sorry, I should have started at the beginning. 15 years is a long time, isn't it? And I was sort of quite surprised to find that we had got so far beyond the publication of the spirit level. And Richard had been encouraging me for some time to think about updating our analyses, feeling that, you know, our presentations were looking rather out of date. So when the Equality Trust came to me towards the end of last year and said, it's going to be 15 years, shall we think about doing a proper update? I was a little bit nervous, but I thought, okay, let's go for it. I ended up doing lots of analysis sort of secretly because I wanted to see what it would show. And then I gave Richard all of the charts as a Christmas present in a little box. He'd probably rather have had a box of chocolates and some new socks, but that's what he got. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is just really sort of take you through that update. And the new report is available on the Equality Trust website. There's a technical appendix with all the methodological details in it that you can download as well if you're interested. And I believe there's going to be a set of slides as well for you to be able to download and use yourselves. So really what we were trying to do was mirror the spirit level analyses, give an update. And you'll probably, those of you who've read the book, and I was surprised by how many that was when we were doing the little poll at the beginning, will remember that our key graph, the one that's probably been most shown, most discussed around the world, was of inequality in relation to an index of health and social problems. Our update of that is what we're now really calling a triple index. It's an index of health, social, and behavioral problems. Because I think what the 15 years since publication of the spirit level has shown Richard and I perhaps the most is how important inequality is as a key to sort of unlocking what we can do to transform our societies towards sustainability. So it felt really important to be looking at environmental problems as well as the health and social problems that we looked at 15 years ago. So it's an update, but it does explore some new dimensions as well. We're pretty much trying to use the same set of countries. We're using the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality, slightly different to what we used before. Doesn't really matter. You find the same things, whichever one you pick. And then we've used updated data, made a judgment call about when to look at the inequality. And so I just want to show you some of those findings. So this is the updated index slide. Here is income inequality in relation to health, social, and environmental problems. And all of the countries that pretty much were at the left-hand side of the graph in the original spirit level are still there, the Scandinavian countries. And we've got the UK, Israel, USA at the more unequal end. And that same strong and significant correlation between health, social, and environmental problems and income inequality. Couple of key differences from 15 years ago. Spain and Portugal used to be much further apart in terms of income inequality. Portugal has become a bit more equal, Spain more unequal. They're now much closer together. But their health, social, and environmental problems mirror their inequality. Japan has become more unequal on the income inequality measure we use, and just, I think its health, social, and environmental problems haven't yet quite caught up with that. We're looking at inequality in relation to the climate crisis, in relation to social cohesion, in relation to young people's life chances, and in relation to population health. So really, those 4 domains. And here is inequality in relation to our brand new index of environmental problems. So that includes 5 things. It includes progress towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It includes the carbon footprint of the rich within each society. It includes a measure of recycling, a measure of air pollution, and a measure that's called multilateralism. And that is the extent to which countries comply with the UN Charter. And again, a strong and significant correlation between income inequality and that new index. So if we're thinking about social cohesion, we have a number of things that we looked at. In the spirit level, in our update, we've also added some new indicators, and we find that when inequality gets worse, so does democracy. That's using the Economist's Democracy Index. So does racial inequality. So does gender inequality. And people's perception that they have equal opportunities is lower in more unequal societies as well. So here's trust. This is a graph that it looks almost exactly the same as the graph that we had in the spirit level 15 years ago, with around 2/3 of the population thinking that other people can be trusted in the more equal countries on the left, and it dropping to more like 1/5 in the more unequal countries. Here's the gender gap, gender inequality. Again, a strong and significant correlation. This is something new that we're showing. And people asked us quite a lot after the publication of the spirit level why we were focusing on income inequality and not also on things like gender inequality and racial inequality. They do all move together. Income inequality is central to understanding gender inequality and racial inequality in different societies, but there are certainly interactions and intersections between all of them. So those measures, racial inequality and gender inequality in relation to income inequality, are in this new report. Here's imprisonment. It was always one of the closest relationships 15 years ago, and it still is. And very interesting to be looking at this now in the context of what the new Labour government are having to deal with in terms of dealing with the prison crisis. Certainly they have inherited it, but actually our current prison crisis in the UK is the result of a long-standing failure to think about social justice in terms of inequality and to come up with alternatives to imprisonment. So although I'm quite pleased by some of the direction of travel we're seeing from Labour around this, they're still talking about building new prisons rather than actually really trying to bring down the rates of imprisonment that we have in the UK. So moving on to young people's life chances, and I think the current climate for youth is really tough. Our young people are really having to deal with an extremely anxiety-inducing set of poly-crises, really. They've come through a pandemic. They're having to cope with the cost of living crisis. There's a lot that's really challenging young people. Their mental health levels are really high. And we know that inequality affects children's life chances really from before birth onwards. So we know that inequality is related to their well-being, to their educational outcomes. It's related to the teenage birth rates, related to social mobility. It's also related to the extent to which governments invest in early childhood, which we know can help to mitigate some of the inequalities that children are facing. Here's income inequality in relation to the UNICEF dimensions of child well-being. And we first showed that inequality was related to UNICEF's measures of child well-being back in 2007. And consistently over the years, as they've published new updated measures of child well-being, we've shown over again that they're related to inequality. And in fact, in 2015, we showed that changes in child well-being were related to changes in income inequality over a decade. So there's that relationship still as strong as ever. And here's income inequality in relation to a measure of social mobility. And again, I think this is something that can help unite people across the political spectrum in understanding the damage caused by inequality. Sometimes people think that if there's enough social mobility, that's good enough, and we don't have to worry about income inequality. But the two are very, very tightly related. And we really can see here that you don't get equality of opportunity without having greater equality of outcomes. So I think this is a measure and this is a relationship that can help us campaign across the political spectrum. So our last dimension is to do with population health and well-being. Perhaps particularly important to be thinking about this in a post-COVID world and in a world of rising mental health problems. We find that rising inequality worsens infant mortality, life satisfaction, chronic diseases, mental illnesses. And so I'll just show you one or two from there. Here's infant mortality. More babies die in more unequal countries. And in fact, in the UK, we have seen an increase in the infant mortality rate since austerity, particularly marked since 2014. It seemed to plateau out post-pandemic for a couple of years, but the most recent data, which have only just been released, show another increase in infant mortality in the United Kingdom. So this is a really important measure to be focusing on. We know from this new analysis and from the work of several other academics that more unequal countries had higher excess mortality related to COVID. More unequal countries had a worse pandemic. And that's for all kinds of reasons, including the level of health inequalities in those countries prior to the pandemic, the level of trust within those societies and to the extent to which people would then be compliant with the measures needed. Lots of reasons why we see more COVID deaths in more unequal countries and related to governance as well. And if we think about this in light of the first report from the COVID inquiry, you can see that understanding inequality is really a key to understanding what happened in the UK and other countries with COVID. Here's child overweight. In our report, we have a chart showing both child overweight and adult obesity, but it's quite complicated, so I thought I'd just put one of them on the chart for tonight. We see differences in relation to inequality, where we're going from around a quarter of children being overweight in most of the more equal countries and rising up to close to sort of 40% in the more unequal countries. And this, of course, is related to people's lifelong chances of good health and well-being. So I'm going to stop now. I hope you'll all find time to download the report from the Equality Trust website, share the charts, discuss them with friends, with family, with colleagues, sort of take in that extent of the findings. When we were doing things for the spirit level, we knew less about the sheer breadth of the impact of inequality. So I think what we could say today is that we now know it's even wider an impact than we thought. It's even deeper. It's been going on for so long. Some of the statistics are really quite shocking. And we know now that addressing inequality is key to population health and well-being. It's key to our social relationships and the quality of our social life and community life, and it's key to addressing the climate crisis. So I'm going to stop now and hand over to Priya, And Priya, just tell me when you'd like me to move the slides forward.
Thank you, Kate. So yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm Priya Sani Nicholas, and I am Joe's counterpart, co-executive director of the Equality Trust. And just full disclosure, I was not meant to be doing this section this evening. It was supposed to be our senior researcher, Annie Gahor, and I'm so sorry for her to be missing out. She's really, really poorly. She's put such a lot of work in to this update alongside Kate and Richard. She's done such an amazing amount of work on this, and I'm really sad that she can't be here to share the recommendations with you. But anyway, so please bear with me. I'm going to do the best that I can to talk through some of our recommendations from the report and how we're kind of approaching dismantling structural inequalities. So just before we move on to the actual specifics and individual recommendations, I just wanted to take a little bit of time to discuss how we need to be thinking about framing our work around inequality going forward. So in the last 15 years since the Spirit Level was released, we've had an outpouring of evidence on why inequality is crucial to address and how it affects everyone. So, you know, decision makers can't hide behind the sentiment of lack of evidence anymore when discussing the urgency of inequality. And so we deeply need to prioritise placing our attention, all of our efforts and our ambitions towards an inequality first approach that is pan-governmental. It can't be an afterthought, it can't be shoehorned in, because we cannot let these disparities harden or get worse. And when we are prioritising inequality, we need to address two constant shortcomings to make change real. One is the need to shift away from short-term planning, to shift away from the 2-year, 4-year projects that are often tied to the lifespan of governmental terms or to the lifespan of people in office. Because this type of planning is woefully insufficient in addressing the decades and decades and even centuries of underinvestment that has disregarded the people facing inequalities that are living with. And we need to change that policy investment landscape to reflect this. The second is in respect of communities, recognising that a one-size-fits-all policy doesn't work. Each individual communities come with their own histories, their own composition. And we've seen that when we've been using broad one-size-fits-all brushstrokes towards inequality reduction, even when we've had really ambitious or exciting projects. Sorry, we're still back on that other slide, Kate. Yeah, thank you. So even when we've had really ambitious or exciting projects, we've seen that 5 or 10 years down the line, communities or people in the margins of these communities have come out and said that despite this investment being made and all the hope around the project, they have not seen the material benefits. And this is partly because the priorities that are identified and the policy suggestions have not included people from the community in the development process. And we're going to speak a little bit later about co-production as a way of mitigating this. So next slide, please. So for the people that do go on to read the report, you'll see that we've got about 45 recommendations that we put forward. And this slide here is here to kind of just give an overview of the types of recommendations that we'll give and the headings that we've grouped them under. So we've put forward policy recommendations on just transition, on building cohesive and engaged communities, on healthy and safe communities, and recommendations for the people-centred governance and work. And this is all about giving autonomy and power back to residents so that they're in a better position to have stakes in their work, in the economy and in their communities, and therefore to have be in a position to provide strength and support to one another. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we're kind of looking at some of the recommendations from the report and ones that are kind of we're already seeing great work on, and they're already kind of within the public sphere of debate and action. So these are some of the short-term wins, and that with continued campaigning, advocacy and mobilisation, and especially with the support of people like you in the room and others working on them, we hope should be actualised very soon. So the first recommendation is to work on raising the national living wage and national living wage that is in line with GDP per capita. So we've heard a lot of conversations about the growth of the economy, the growth of the economy, the growth of the economy. So we really need to make sure that the strength of the economy and that the growth of the economy is shared with all the workers who are providing the goods and services that hold it up. ensuring that they are making a decent living wage and reducing in-work poverty. We now know that 15% of people that are in work are living in poverty as well. Income from work is no longer sufficient to have a standard of living, and that can't be right. So we need to make sure that national living wage is in line with inflation and the cost of living. So we've recently been provided a consultation to the Low Pay Commission looking at exactly this matter. The second one is about reforming council taxes from being this flat and regressive to a progressive taxing, and that reflects the household's ability to pay. So we have strong campaigns already going on from Fairer Housing, who are doing really great work on this. Another recommendation is about tackling income inequality, is where to kind of TET has its foundations and where we began, and we're continuing to champion for the reduction in the high pay ratio between CEOs and workers. And in fact, just today, not just today, but in today's landscape, the pay ratio between the median FTSE 100 CEO to the median UK full-time worker has risen and currently stands at 118 to 1. And lastly, other work we're looking at is about equalising tax on capital gains to match the tax we pay on income. It just doesn't seem fathomable that income that you get from not working is taxed at lower rates than income you get from actually working. So we know peer organisations such as Tax Justice and Patriotic Millionaires are doing great work on this already. Next slide, please. So moving forward, we're looking at some of the more exciting opportunities that begin and that kind of be looking to actually transform what our societies look like. So we want to put well-being at the heart of our economy. Right now, we can see success. We see our success marked through very crude GDP metrics that are overly focused on economic growth as a goal and which fail to capture inequality, social costs, and environmental harm, especially when we now know most of this growth goes to people who are already in the 1%. And we're seeing more and more governments globally, both on a kind of national and a subnational scale, moving towards adopting new measures which incorporate a more holistic approach. And we're seeing changing mental models of success, asking residents, if they have a good quality of life. And by measuring a broader suite of indicators that capture multidimensional well-being, including health, education, inequality, environmental quality, and subjective well-being like mental health. Secondly, we want to see a moving away from the decades of over-centralised governance towards more class and place-based approaches through a broad suite of tools known as community wealth building. So local councils, as we all know, many of them have been going bankrupt, many more on the verge of bankruptcy. Communities are disenfranchised from decision-making that affects them. We saw 19 million people not turning out to vote at our recent general election. And we've seen hundreds of millions of pounds of wealth being generated by cities that are then leaked out from the city and going to big business when they could instead be using that money to reinvest back into the local community themselves. So the kind of tools that we're thinking about here are plural ownership for the local economy, for example, through more community-owned assets, progressive public procurement that benefits local supply chains, fair employment, just labour markets through good work, as well as socially just use of land and property. And I think that there's something that's also that Keir Starmer's been alluding to in the decentralisation is the ability for local communities to buy social assets. We've also seen the Scottish Government committing to this through the introduction of the world's first Community Wealth Building Act. And hopefully, again, like with Labour committing to fiscal devolution, this might give us a chance for more community wealth building practices to be appropriately invested to stop this wealth leaking out from communities. The other thing we want to see introduced is the permanent and progressive wealth taxes. So the recommendations are to start with a 2% tax on assets over £10 million and a 5% tax on billionaire wealth. Over 72% of the UK public is in support of these types of taxes, but they're still not being blocked or being campaigned from within. But there is real strong favour for this, so we'll continue to be advocating for this going forward. And lastly, is transforming the social security system. The rest of these recommendations are really exciting, but they do also represent a very middle class sentiment of betterment. And we need to make sure that we have tangible and very real benefits brought back to people through our social security systems, which have been decimated. So this could involve revising existing welfare policies to end poverty increasing caps, to reduce conditionalities, and ending punitive sanctions, particularly for vulnerable populations and those with caregiving responsibilities. Universal credit needs to have an essentials guarantee so that the basic rate covers life's essentials, including the cost of food, household bills, travel, and cleaning equipment. And we need to guarantee that nobody falls between the cracks. The transformation must replace the one-size-fits-all methods with proper combination of targeted, population-focused programs and universal policies. Next slide, please. And lastly, these are the kind of long-term goals that the Equality Trust is particularly active on campaigning and advocating on. The first two are inclusive participatory governance and on creating co-production mechanisms. So what we mean by that is developing the mechanisms and genuinely closed feedback loops for communities to actively participate in identifying needs and agenda setting, participatory budgeting, consulting on designing services and how best to implement them, and overseeing accountability and monitoring through co-production processes. And these are also really well captured in meaningful enactment of the socioeconomic duty. And the reason we're focusing so heavily on this is because we know that if we want to change the structure of society, we need to change who gets to design it. Much of how we're operating now is still based on relics of a different era of decision making. And to better understand the challenges and intersections of inequality and the ways that we might go around dismantling it, we need something that reflects what is happening for people right now. We need different research and different understanding of how we can be more deliberative in democratic decision making, and we need that broader expertise from local communities. So we can find this in traditional empirical data, but crucially as well from people's lived and living experiences. People directly impacted by inequality should be involved as architects of change. They should be shaping public development at every stage, and their involvement is crucial for developing relevant and effective solutions. We can also know that when we utilise this type of expertise, when we count it as expertise, people are actually far more likely to be ambitious in what they envision for this country and be more willing and more responsible to be inconvenienced by the changes we need to make in order to achieve them. Co-production is becoming increasingly valued and changing the way we work to make sure that change doesn't benefit the same people and to make sure that inequalities don't widen by recognising that academic-led priorities only get us so far and we need to have community-led priorities as well. And as the Equality Trust's own commitment to this and to be reflexive, we will be hosting a series of reimagining events between this year and next year. And in these events, we'll be revising our work after speaking with communities on what areas of action they'd like to see and what they see as being the most urgent and necessary, and their ideas of how to build futures and policies together, and how these potential solutions can work in practice. And this might mirror some of the recommendations of the work we've set out so far, or they might look totally different and will change accordingly to meet that. There'll be really exciting events and we'll be sending more details out on these shortly, but I strongly encourage everyone here today to look out for these, to attend, to share your thoughts and to bring some of that people power back to decision making. And just something you can do today, if you want to take action on the inequality we've been talking about right now, we're asking our supporters to write to their MPs, asking them to take immediate action on inequality. So we've got a 2-minute letter writing tool. You can just kind of log in and send off, or you can tailor the letter to include any issues that matter most to you. So the link for this will be coming up in the chat right now. So that's the end of my bit of chatting. Thank you very much for moving the slides along so expertly there, Kate. So we can now open the floor over to questions from other people. We had some questions that were sent in ahead of the session today. Shall I just start with one of those? Shall I throw one over to you, Kate and Richard? So we had a question here from Thomas Daniels, and he asks, what are your views on non-violent direct action to achieve systems change when we know that asking for change has not worked, such as the approaches used by the suffragettes, Gandhi, or Just Stop Oil?
Well, I think it's an important question, and of course, it's come up with Let's Stop Oil.
Just Stop Oil.
Just Stop Oil. Yes, and it obviously is a very difficult issue to decide. And Extinction Rebellion, I think, has done some rethinking on it. But I feel the key, if you think of the examples that the questioner mentions, for instance, Gandhi. In Indian independence, the key was the moral superiority of the direct action they were taking, so that actually stopping them doing what they were doing would put the authorities in a less moral light. So, for instance, if you had a campaign of non-payment of tax, and instead paid the same amount of money in really obviously socially important ways, I mean, related perhaps to food banks and so on, so the authorities would be seen as actually stopping something they should be dealing with themselves. You can put the forms of direct action which put authorities into a morally inferior position. And I do think that's key. And it means thinking the strategy through further than Just Stop Oil. Blocking motorways doesn't have that element in it.
Sorry, couldn't find my mute button. Kate, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think the only thing I'd add to that is we each have to do, I think, what we feel we're capable of, good at. You know, we all make different contributions to the fight for greater equality. And for some people that might be taking part in non-violent direct action. For others, it will be writing to their MPs or talking to people. I think there's something that all of us can do, and we just need to find what feels right for us, the contribution that we feel we can make. I feel, for example, that Richard and I as epidemiologists, the best contribution we can make is to keep on producing research that demonstrates the difference is that inequality makes. But as you said, Priya, academic research only takes us far enough. So there are, other things that need to be happening. But I think everybody can contribute in their own ways.
Yeah, that makes sense, and beautifully democratic. So another question here from John Baker, who's asking, do you know of any research similar to your own that connects inequality with support for the far right?
Yes, we do actually. And I was just checking this online earlier. There's a paper by an author called Stoetzer, that's Stoetzer, and his colleagues, that was published in 2021. That's a sort of a review of this area. And he mentions 5 or 6 different studies of income inequality in relation to more support for populist views. It's not always easy to study this academically, because sometimes the measures of populism and support for populism include support for both the far right and the far left. And so, they're not always distinguished. But I think we can all feel this as well when we're looking at the political division, for example, in the United States, and how extreme that has become in the most unequal of the rich developed countries. And I think we've had a strong taste of that over the past 14 years in the UK, and seeing what Brexit did do to political divisions within our country, and that probably being a result of inequality and people feeling left behind. So I think the answer is broadly yes, and there is a body of research out there. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I remember rather well a study, I think that was a German study, of people in the small areas that had voted most strongly in support, I think it was explicitly of right-wing populists. And they went and interviewed people in those small areas supporting the right-wing populists. And they found a common element in France and Germany was that they felt they had been devalued. And that fits rather well with the support for Trump, for instance. But there's also research showing that political polarization is related to income inequality. That's mainly, I think, American research, but it's quite good standard.
Okay, thank you. So another question here. Kate and Richard, given your experience in trying to present the concepts of the spirit level to the general public, what are the ideas that ordinary folk find the hardest to believe?
I think it's usually the other way round. People say, didn't we know that? Isn't that obvious?
I think that is a much more common reaction, that people feel that what we're showing them makes sense of their intuitions, it makes sense of their experience, it makes sense of the change that they would like to see in the world. So I think that is much the most common reaction. Can you think of anything people find difficult?
The people who most often have difficulty with it is economists. And I think they had difficulty with it when they were really not prepared to think about psychosocial things at all. The social world was, they did think very much in terms of the sort of economic man or economic woman. That was human nature. And I think that meant they found our relationships rather surprising.
Thank you. So, Kate, you mentioned infant mortality spiking following austerity policies. What other examples are there of countries that have taken steps, so either positive or negative, that have led to changes in both inequality and social and environmental outcomes? E.g., I think we talked about Portugal and Spain changing their kind of levels of income inequality, and Japan as well. So what led to these policies being enacted?
It's a host of things. I mean, if you think about what governments do, they can hardly even sort of move without affecting inequality one way or another. Usually only in small bits, a little bit up, a little bit down, but almost everything they do affects inequality. So Spain, we know, had a particularly bad recession following the global financial crisis. And that was probably a prime driver of its growing inequality. It'll be different things in different places. What we've not seen anywhere, I don't think, in recent years is any large countries completely committing to inequality reduction. We've seen countries commit to poverty reduction, and Brazil went quite a long way with that at some point, and had policies like Bolsa Familia, which was social security for very poor families, and really did manage to shift some of its proceeds of economic growth to the poorest. But we haven't seen anything like we saw in Sweden in the 1930s, in the last century, where the country committed to becoming a much more equal place. Now, you mentioned economies that are focused on well-being. And there are now 6 countries within the Wellbeing Economy Governance Alliance. That is Wales, Scotland, Iceland, Finland, New Zealand, and Canada is playing along. And they're committed to pursuing well-being more than economic growth. Inequality reduction is part of that, and is quite central to that thinking. So I think they're probably the best contemporary examples we've got of governments that are really trying to do things differently.
Can I just say, only slightly related to that, the fact that Japan is so often an outlier in the graphs Kate showed. There are controversies about the Japanese data. We had, of course, to use the data that the OECD provides, but we had some arguments with the person who produced it. And I believe they have 3 different income surveys, which all give rather different picture. But there is, as Kate said, also the fact that there are changes in inequality, there are large changes in inequality, the figures suggest. are recent. So even if they were true, it might be that there are lag periods that take quite a while to filter through.
Thank you. So Kate, you mentioned the inequality reduction kind of approach that Sweden adopted in the 1930s. Did something else happen with the other Scandinavian countries? Were they always far more equal, or was it a real concerted effort by their governments at some points to?
I don't know. I think you'd need to ask an economic historian that question, and I don't think we should speak beyond our areas of expertise. But I suspect that they saw what good things were happening in Sweden and decided to sort of follow along. But I might be wrong about that.
I think in the 30s there were big strikes in the timber, in the sawmills and so on in Sweden, and there was an election, I think, perhaps triggered by those strikes, and the Social Democratic Party was elected, and they remained in power for about 40 years. And the Prime Minister at the beginning of that period said, we will make Sweden a classless society, the people's home. And apparently that idea was taught even in primary schools right through until at least the 1980s.
So we've got to hope that England is going to copycat what's happening in Scotland and Wales with the wellbeing economy. That same mentality is going to take us through. Sorry. Just scrolling through the questions here. So a question here, is there a growing number of people conducting similar research to you, Kate and Richard? Is it becoming a much wider interest in academia, or was it always in, a big interest?
Oh, it's really grown. When Richard first published a paper looking at income inequality in relation to health in a few countries, was that early 1980s? There was
later,
there was very little research out there, and that field grew, and now there are a huge number of academics who have produced research, are active researchers on this topic across quite a wide range of disciplines. So there are psychologists, there are economists, there are sociologists, there are social epidemiologists like us, political scientists. So the literature has really, really grown. I mean, that is, to be honest, that's true of most academic disciplines. They've all seen a huge increase in number of papers coming out because there's too many journals. But I think it's impressive that depth of research, and we're lucky enough to often be sent papers to review before they're published. So we get to see things as they're being sort of worked out. And I think what we can say now about that body of evidence is that it is extremely robust, and that it really suggests a causal relationship between income inequality and all the sorts of outcomes we're talking about. It's not going to be true in every single context, for every single outcome, at every single point in time, but I think we know enough now to be able to act on that evidence.
Yes, all relationships that we're concerned with are statistical, which means there are many other influences on the outcomes we're looking at, and sometimes they overshadow the effects of inequality.
So is that a kind of change since, the first public spirit level publication, that the relationship is now causal and not just correlative? Correlation?
Yes, I think so. I mean, if we sometimes say that if we had £1 for every time somebody had said to us correlation doesn't prove causation, we'd be in the top 1%, and we could just retire on the of our inequality research. But I think, yes, that is a change, and we ourselves published a causal review of the research on income inequality and health in 2015, where we looked at all of the studies that were out there, and we are now talking about hundreds, to see whether or not the evidence met epidemiological criteria for causality, which it did.
Thank you. So someone else is asking about the weight we're giving to wealth inequality as relative to income inequality, and does that kind of vary country by country?
We took income inequality alone, partly because when we did the spirit level, there was very little or no data, internationally comparable data on wealth inequality. There is now much more data. I've seen very little research looking at wealth inequality in relation to some of the outcomes we've been talking about. I do know of one paper where the relationship between wealth inequality and health looks very like what we've been showing with income inequality. So ideally, I think one would have a sort of a mixed, well, you'd combine income and wealth inequality in some kind of index and call it economic inequality or whatever.
It's much easier to hide wealth than it is to hide income. You know, we have good comparable data from different countries because countries tax income, and so the data are available. It's much easier to hide wealth. I mean, I think that's one more good reason to tax wealth, because then we'd have better records and we could do more analyses with those data.
And I don't know if I'm now pushing you into a corner and asking you another question that's out of your wheelhouse, but do you have any thoughts on the kind of global tax work that's kind of taking place at the moment or underway?
Say a bit more about what you mean.
So one of the things to kind of as a mitigating factor against people hiding wealth offshore is having a global wealth tax. Yeah,
absolutely. And if you're going to have a global wealth tax, then you're going to create data. You're going to have to have mechanisms that then create data. I mean, one thing that happened really recently was that the World Bank decided it was going to measure extreme inequality. That's a first. The threshold they've chosen is probably more extreme than we would want to see. But I think that helps. The more international attention there is to the idea that inequality is a bad thing and that something must be done about it, including things like taxing money that's put in tax havens and global financial transaction tax and those sorts of things, the better.
But there have been attempts to deal with tax evasion internationally in the tax havens, international action through OECD. And at one stage it looked quite promising, as if it would be effective in closing some of those tax havens, but I think it hasn't worked out as well as people initially hoped. But it does, of course, mean joint action. And so organizations like the EU and the OECD are really important in that context.
Yeah, definitely. So another question here, and I'm not sure if we did actually answer it in the presentation, but I was wondering, have you found any correlation between inequality levels and human motivational values?
There was, I think there are quite important relationships which are often misunderstood. Subjective measures are particularly difficult in relation to inequality, because one of the effects of inequality is that people have to be sort of present as a tough individualism, and in our mind it's symbolized by the 4x4 cars with and names of models like Defender and Shogun and all that kind of thing. But it means actually that if you look at measures of self-reported health, you find that they are internationally not related to death rates, almost an inverse relationship.
But I think this question the question was about motivational values, wasn't it?
So that.
Oh, okay. Sorry, interrupted you before we finished.
That shows us an overlying different representation of emotions, and you report yourself as strong and capable and driven by whatever it is. But I think the data shows, for instance, on consumerism, that there is a very strong desire to use goods and your purchases to make yourself look better in other people's eyes. And of course, advertisers are always, they don't really tell you about their goods. They just convince you that it'll make you look superior in different ways. But I think all sorts of things to do with motivation, what's the self-enhancement, a measure that has been studied in relation to inequality, shows that people are bigging themselves up in more unequal contexts.
What about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations? I mean, I think we think those are shaped by
I've
inequality.
seen one paper, sorry.
Oh, go on.
One paper, I think, that showed that in more unequal countries, people fit the idea of external locus of control, i.e. if you ask people what they think their lives and future depends on, some people will say, well, it's a matter of what I do, my efforts, my choices, I determine it. Other people will feel it's what's done to them, it's what happens to them, external locus of control rather than internal locus of control. And it does look from that paper, I remember rather vaguely, as if more inequality increases external locus of control. It's just fate, what happens to you.
Thank you. We've got some questions about how we can kind of do bridging the gap between academic research and reach out to kind of popular understanding. That might be more of a kind of equality trust kind of area of work. So maybe I could start to answer that, and Joe, you could leap in if I've missed anything hugely pertinent. So I think, we've just done some strategic development, and so a lot of that is looking at how we want to achieve, affect the change that we want to see, what kind of work we need to do to do that. So it was mentioned earlier that, we are a research-led organisation. So we have academic research done by people like Kate and Richard, and also Annie, our very poorly senior researcher, and others within the Equality Trust team, which is much more qualitative research. We also conduct quantitative research with members of our Equality Trust team. We've got Caroline, Emma and Maeve, I think, all on the call here, and they work with people in communities trying to understand and priorities, and have community kind of led priorities and agenda setting for what's impacting them and the change that they'd like to see. So we try to take a kind of marriage of the two. And then we do kind of two things with that. We try and build pressure from outside so that policymakers can't fail to kind of hear what's going on around them. We know that if we just go straight to policymakers, if that policymaker leaves their job, or if there's a department reshuffle, then you kind of lose a lot of that momentum. So to kind of, and it takes a long time. I think we've said this before many times. It takes a long time to get that change. So we try and do two things. One is to build that sustainable pressure from outside that's going to be sustained by the people living in communities. So it doesn't matter whether people from the Equality Trust move on from jobs. It doesn't matter if the people that we're trying to influence move on from jobs. That pressure is still sustained because the people living there still have the same needs. So that's kind of one thing we do. And then the other kind of side to the same coin, I suppose, is trying to build those inroads and those genuine feedback loops with the people that can actually make the change. So linking up seldom heard or unheard voices with kind of policymakers and decision makers, and building open communication channels so that we can check so that there's a feedback to see if how things are landing, if it's actually making a difference, what tweaks can be made, rather than a one-off, one hit, this is it, I've done that thing that you asked us to do. So trying to have that accountability built in there. Joe, did you want to add anything to that brief?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you said is, it's absolutely, the direction that we're going in. And I just wanted to pick up on something that our colleague Emma, who is working in Birmingham, has popped in the chat, which I think is you know, something that we're thinking a lot more about, which is about movement building and the approaches that we take to making sure that this is not a top-down endeavour, and that we genuinely are bringing people with us and looking at that gap between public concern about inequality and the real damage it is causing every single day. Like, you know, I think that is, you know, it's a real core part of where our new strategy is heading. So yeah.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you, Emma. Does anybody have any other questions they wanted to put forward?
Could I just add to that?
Oh yes, please do,
yeah,
Emma.
yeah. So I think just from what I've put in the chat, you know, there are kind of three. You know, we got some training from Neon, who do a lot of stuff around movement building and a lot of historical work around what's worked well in terms of any kind of social justice movement and change historically. And basically, you know, history shows us that it has to come from grassroots, from below, and we can't be doing stuff to people. And the three kind of main areas that they've highlighted in terms of that movement building are kind of challenging dominant institutions. So stuff like the socioeconomic duty would be kind of, we've got a campaign around that, where we're campaigning around that. And then personal empowerment. So the stuff that we're doing around recruiting community reporters, the co-production stuff, which is all around building capacity of people with lived experience of economic inequality. And then the final one is building alternatives. So in Birmingham, I posted in the thing, there's the Economic Justice Alliance, which looks at different economic models. I think donut economics was put in the chat. So we've had talk about donut economics. We've also working with Birmingham City Council on the socioeconomic duty. So I think if people are interested in that, I would point you to Neon if you're interested in the whole movement building thing. They've got some really good resources. Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. So John's popped a question in the chat, and he's asking, what is the relationship between investing in the public domain, e.g. things like public transport, education, green spaces and health, and greater equality? Do the two always go hand in hand? And then a secondary question, are more equal countries more likely to invest in public goods, or is it the other way around?
No, you go, you go.
The relationship, and there have been a number of studies trying to see actually whether it is income differences that matter, or whether it's how good public services are, and so they've controlled one for the other. And it looks from that as if it is income inequality, but it was an issue simply because more equal societies tend to have better public services. So that's why the question came up. Could it possibly be the better public services rather than the income inequality? They both obviously contribute to better results, but it looked as if income inequality was the most important.
It's not quite the chicken and egg situation it might have been.
I think not.
Stephen, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, it's probably one of the few people from the United States on this event, which I really value immensely. What do you think are the reactions in the United States to both the spirit level and the inner level? It seems to be much harder to get traction in this country to inequality. Studies show that people don't seem to want to tax the rich more. They seem to, because they might win the lottery someday and become rich. Can you contrast the United States and the UK in your ideas?
Shall I start?
Yes.
I mean, I must say, Stephen, it's really good to see you.
Yes, it is.
I must say that we've done together now, Rich and I, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 talks all across the world. we've lost track of the numbers, but it's a lot easier to show our stuff in Scandinavia or New Zealand than it is in the United States. I think it's very difficult for the public and policymakers in general to see our charts and see again and again and again that the USA does worse, and this, you know, I think it's quite difficult. I think there was a nice study, I think came out of maybe Harvard and Princeton, where Americans were asked to choose what distribution of wealth and incomes they preferred, and they overwhelmingly, whether they were Democrat or Republican, young or old, of different ethnicities, men or women, preferred an income distribution that looked much more like Sweden than it does look like the American one. These weren't labeled as such. But I think you're right. The idea of the American dream is still a powerful thing that most Americans believe in. They do think they might win the lottery. They do think their child might become a basketball star. They do have aspirations to individual success and think it could just happen if they worked hard enough. And they seem to hold those views more strongly than people in Europe do, for example. But, you know, the chart that we just showed, looking at social mobility in relation to income inequality, shows that very sadly, it is the most unequal countries where that is least likely to happen for people. So I think we need to find ways to convey that to the American public, to share that with American policymakers. But I think often the most effective communication of research in America will come from American academics, because there is that sense of American exceptionalism where they do tend to think that things that are produced elsewhere might not really be relevant to them.
But Steve, your question reminds me of you telling me of your lectures, I think, to first-year medical students. And I seem to remember you saying that because Americans tend to believe they have the best of everything, you asked them to write an essay on why America had the best health in the world, which involved them discovering that it does amongst the worst in the rich developed countries. And I think I've had Americans walking out of talks when we've been showing slides that shows how badly the US does on a number of things. But it also reminds me of a joke of Kate's when showing social mobility is low in more unequal countries.
Someone's just put it in the chat that if you want to live the American dream, you should move to Denmark.
Yes, you want to live it rather than just dream it.
Okay, so we're running short of time. I'm just going to ask one more question that we had sent in earlier, and then we'll go to Mike, and then I'm afraid we'll try and get to other questions outside of here. And I've tried to leave the questions that were more focused on equality trust people. We can answer that later. I thought I'd try and throw as many questions over to Kate and Richard as possible as we had them here. So one question, I think it might be a more equality trust related question, but it's about, it's from Vanessa, and she's asking, what are the implications of Westminster's non-commencement of the socio-economic duty, which is Section 1 of the Equality Act? And what is the duty's potential now that the newly elected Party of Government's manifesto pledges its activation? Do you want to speak to this, Kate or Richard?
Obviously, them not enacting it was part of what has condemned us to 14 years of no progress on inequality. And that was such a landmark piece of legislation. Had it been enacted, it would have been a real powerful agent for change. And I'm absolutely delighted that it is in Labour's manifesto. I think that's really crucial and important. When they will enact it, I don't know. You might know more than I do, Priya. But I would expect that this might be something they do a bit later in their term after they've settled some of the more immediate things. But I think it's we've seen it enacted in Scotland and Wales and some local authorities taking it on. And I think anything that shifts policymakers' minds to the impact of what they're doing on socioeconomic inequalities has got to be a good thing.
Can I be a slight obstacle to your plans, Priya? I
Yes.
think Steve's question was a really important one. And actually, he knows the likely answers better than I suspect anyone here. He's written several books about inequality and spent a long time studying these issues. So, Steve, can you say just very briefly how you would answer your question?
Well, I think the point you made about beliefs in the American dream, when students go to school every morning, they do the Pledge of Allegiance. And so early in life, it's instilled in people that this is the best country in the world, bar none. And you can see this, why are so many people supporting Trump, this bonding social cohesion? They're supposed to believe that they're the best, but they're not feeling the best. And our international students, when they come here, they're told to tell everyone at every encounter that they have to have a nice day. 30 years ago, our students weren't told that because we were having nicer days then, and we're not now. And this is leading to a tremendous amount of political turmoil, and telling somebody to have a nice day just isn't going to do it. So, it's these beliefs on American exceptionalism that are inculcated at an early age, I think are very hard to change later.
Steve, when I asked you, I didn't realize that we were 1 minute from the end. So thank you.
Thank you. So now we're at the end. Bob, do you want to? Oh, sorry, it's Mike. I saw Hope. I just went Bob Hopes. I'm so sorry. It's late. You have to forgive me now. Mike, come on. You've waited this long.
Yeah, okay. Again, I wanted to hark back to Stephen's question because it was really so good. I mean, in addition to the things that you yourself said, Steve, I think a formal funeral for the trickle-down theory and for health insurance would be a really good thing. Because there is complete denial with regard to that. But I did want to pop in a question that somebody had asked in the chat, which hasn't been addressed, which I thought was really important. Is there a link between the equality of countries and domestic violence and abuse?
Yes, there is. This again, it's not an easy thing to study because of the nature of reporting of domestic violence differing across
Can't say how often do you hit your wife?
Countries. What we've done to show that is use data from Latin America, actually, where data was collected in a consistent way in a particular set of surveys that were being used in Latin American countries, where women were answering questions about their life and their family life in settings where they, it seems, were able to disclose. And there's also some cultural consistency across those countries, so you wouldn't think, oh, the differences between countries are being driven by cultural differences in the reporting of that. And in that study, which I did with a colleague from another university who came to an Equality Trust meeting, I think, and encouraged me to look into this, we did find that greater inequality was related to more domestic violence, to more intimate partner violence. But that goes along with studies that have shown more child mistreatment, more bullying in schools, the homicide rates, of course. It's all kinds of violence and all kinds of disrespect of other people and bullying and putting people down that we see rising with greater inequality.
Thank you. And sorry for missing that question in the chat. It's been a flurry. So Thank you, everybody. I'm so sorry we've run over time. I want to say a really huge thank you to Richard and Kate for all your support in getting together this update, and of course to Annie, who's not here, for all her hard work as well. And, you know, like you said, Kate, at the beginning, it's really important to keep having updated data as much as possible that stays relevant, and it's, you know, still true as much today. So this is going to be a really useful tool in helping us talk about inequality and helping us understand inequality. And as we've said before, we're going to do our next stage now of working with community groups and other peer organisations to see how these kind of academic recommendations that we've got will work in practice, and whether they resonate with the needs and priorities of people on the ground in tackling structural inequalities. So thank you so much. We couldn't have done this without you, and we couldn't do it without all of our staff who are here on the call as well, and without all of you guys supporting and spreading the word. I think Dario is going to put in the chat the link again for how you can write to your MP. So that would be a great thing to do. I think tomorrow morning we'll send around a copy of the talk, a copy of the report, and some other kind of things. I think one of the things we're definitely going to be sending around is a feedback form. It's only got 3 questions on, but it does help ever so much in planning for our next event. So thank you so much, everybody. Go off and enjoy your evenings. It's still nice and light. Lots of hope to come. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thank